Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. And I'll pass it. She has a sign-in sheet that we have to fill out. And then with that sign-in sheet, she will email PGP certificate. All right, just so we have that. And we're also videotaping for our pager. Agers go forward as well. They don't have to come on PGP. So,
thanks. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Again, my name's Elaine. I am so excited to be here. Thanks for hanging with me for the next hour. We're going to talk about human trafficking. Not the most fun topic in the world, so grateful for your attention and participation for the next hour. First off, I know we have a lot going on. There's just a lot going on in the world, and this is another heavy topic, right? So take care of yourself. Some of the stuff is kind of heavy. So if you need to take breaks, do whatever you need to do, please feel free to do so. Some of the content is just heavy. So wanted to kind of start off with that. But again, my name's Elaine, and I'm from the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. So we are a statewide program. And all across Indiana, our goals are to, one, provide training and education about what human trafficking is. So there's a lot of misinformation about human trafficking and what it looks like specifically in Indiana. So we're hoping today to kind of get any questions you have about trafficking answered, do some myth-busting moments, talk about what is and isn't true about trafficking in Indiana. Another big part of what that does is we partner with folks all across the state. So our goal is to have service providers and agencies prepared to identify trafficking when it walks in their door. So hopefully after today, you feel more equipped to understand what does it look like in my community, when I'm at the grocery store, when it's sitting in my classroom, things like that. So we partner with folks across the state and can provide financial reimbursements when folks help us serve those people. So that's pretty awesome. We're broken up into 10 regions, and so I serve these 9 counties, and so I'm doing all of that in these 9 counties. So again, I'm really happy to be here. I've been in this role for a little over 3 years. I've been involved in anti-trafficking work for quite some time, but have really enjoyed the opportunity to have this role and do this for the state in our lovely region. ITVAP is housed at IYSA. I know you guys are probably also used to the world of acronyms, but all our acronyms sound the same and start with I. ITVAP is a program of IYSA. So our organization fulfills those 4 main core roles, and based on what I explained what our organization does, we can fall into all 4 of those through our work. So, what are we going to do today? I would love to do introductions in here from all of you, but for time's sake, unfortunately, we're going to have to skip that. So please, yeah, no worries. Fill out our sign-in sheet, and so I can learn a little bit about you too. But today, our time is going to be, one, talking about defining human trafficking. What is it? Talk about mandatory reporting, understanding the role that social media plays in human trafficking, understanding the connections that traffickers have to their victims, recognizing red flags, and talking about how we can hopefully support you in your work. So to start off, I would love to hear from you all. When we talk about human trafficking, you hear the phrase human trafficking, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Could be words, phrases, movies you've watched. What comes to mind?
Danger.
Danger?
Kidnapping.
Kidnapping? Anything else? No wrong answers. I would just love to hear what pops in your brain.
Kids.
Kids?
Facebook.
Sex trafficking.
Forced labor.
Forced labor. And force. Awesome. Thanks for sharing, folks. So, yeah, trafficking can be a lot of things. And so, again, we're going to try and get through kind of what trafficking can look like. It can look very different. So, our definition of human trafficking is the use of force, threat of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into any form of work or service against their will. So again, I've heard people talk about both sex and labor trafficking. Unfortunately, time's sake, we'll talk mostly about sex trafficking, but I'm going to try and sprinkle in some labor trafficking examples as well, because unfortunately, we see both in Indiana, and we'll talk about why. Pretty vague definition, but that's kind of on purpose. It encompasses a lot of things. This is what we call our AMP model. This is how we define and identify something as human trafficking. It's a lovely tool, very easy to use. We need one item from each column, an action, a means, and a purpose. So the word transport. That is often what we first think of. I heard someone mention kidnapping. Our brains go to someone being moved around. But you'll notice that is just one action that could be involved in trafficking. Right above that, we have harbors. Someone may actually be kept in one place, never moved around at all, and trafficked in one space. We also have recruits, provides, obtains, patronizes, and solicits. Those last two, patronizes and solicits, are especially important. We can charge buyers and consumers with human trafficking as well. So oftentimes there's a trafficker, a victim, and a buyer or consumer. This person is buying that other person for sex or labor. They can also be charged with trafficking. And we'll talk more about the dynamic that brings. Our means are force, fraud, and coercion. We'll go into more detail on the next slide about those. For the purpose of labor or services or commercial sexual conduct. So again, this is the breakdown between labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And again, we're going to hear from a survivor today in a series of videos who experienced sex trafficking. So naturally, a lot of our conversation will revolve around that. But please understand labor trafficking happens in Indiana a lot as well. So we're breaking down that force, fraud, and coercion that we saw in the means column. Force. This is often what we first think of as well. Something happening to that person's physical body. But they can also use means of fraud. Maybe there are false promises about what the job is. Maybe there is withholding wages, blackmail, lying about the work conditions. So in a labor trafficking example, someone may be told, you're going to have this great job. We're going to travel the world. You're going to sell this really cool product, make all this money, stay in cool places, travel. It's going to be great. In reality, they may be forced to live in horrible working conditions, sleeping on a hotel floor with 20 other people, not paid what they told they were going to be paid, if at all. Maybe they are from another country. They withhold their documentation. They let it expire, or even lie to them about the process, and they don't actually have valid documentation. Those are some examples of what fraud could look like in a labor trafficking situation. And then lastly, we have coercion. Coercion is often the strongest piece keeping someone stuck in a situation. If you've ever worked in any capacity with domestic violence or something similar, there's a lot of coercion present. And it's also the hardest to prove, as you can imagine. So that includes our intimidation, threats, emotional abuse, creating a climate of fear. So traffickers really want their folks to stick around, their victims to stick around, right? And so this coercion piece is really strong. They want them to feel fear, or maybe even love toward them. There may be very serious threats to where it may not seem safe for them to leave that situation. So again, we just need one of these. But unfortunately, we often see a combination, if not all of them. That is kind of the rundown on our AMP model, what our federal law says makes something human trafficking. Any questions about how the AMP model works? Does that make sense? Cool. So rather than walking through each state statute and what all the words and jargon mean, I have an overview of what our Indiana law currently says about human trafficking. And one of those being very important for folks who work with people who are youth is that individuals under the age of 18 cannot be charged with prostitution. No such thing as a juvenile prostitute, underage prostitute. It does not exist in Indiana. So that means if a youth is involved in commercial sex being anything of value exchanged for any sex act. That could be money, it could be a place to stay, it could be drugs. Anything of value exchanged for any sex act is commercial sex. Any minor involved in that is automatically a victim of sex trafficking. Not committing a crime, a victim of sex trafficking. So some folks get confused, right? At 16, 17, kids can consent to sexual activity. They cannot consent to commercial sex. So once there's a transaction, they are now a victim of sex trafficking. In those cases, we don't have to prove force, fraud, and coercion. So going back to our AMP model, talking about minors and sex trafficking, our means column disappears. We don't have to prove those items in those cases. But in labor trafficking, no matter the age, we always have to prove that force, fraud, and coercion took place for it to be considered trafficking. It's one of the big differences between the two. Next, it's not a defense to promotion of child sex trafficking that a minor consented. So again, they can't legally consent to it. That's to protect the youth, right? They are going to go to bat for their trafficker. They're not going to want to snitch on them. They're not going to say, actually go get him, he's the bad guy, right? They're going to be very afraid of that person, or again, feel that they love that person, not want to get them in trouble. So that is a safety feature for minors. Buyers can be charged with trafficking whether or not they knew the individual they purchased was a human trafficking victim. So again, we talked about the dynamic where there may be a trafficker selling someone and a buyer buying someone. That person can't say, I don't even know what human trafficking is. They consented to be here. I thought they were an adult. I don't know what you're talking about. Doesn't matter. They can still be charged. And then lastly, restitution is available to victims. Civil remedies may be available as well. I think that's all I have for the law. Any questions about what our laws say about trafficking in general, overall? No? Cool. Next, we're going to kind of talk about where does human trafficking happen? Where do we see it? What industries are the most vulnerable to trafficking? Unfortunately, trafficking can happen anywhere. These are just some of the more common spaces that we see it. So this first one, domestic work. I'll share a quick example related to domestic work and labor trafficking. We work with a survivor who agreed to allow us to share her story that was trafficked in Bloomington, Indiana. So she was brought here from another country, was told she was going to go to school, make money, but unfortunately she was forced into involuntary servitude, domestic work, where she was working within someone's home under what appeared to be a nanny or maid category. So she was taking care of the home. She did leave the house, but not on her own terms, right? So the trafficker knew when she was leaving, when she was coming back, sent her on errands, things like that. So we do see situations in Indiana where someone may appear to be in a nanny or maid role, but in reality are being labor trafficked. Restaurants, there may be labor trafficking taking place where someone's forced to work or maybe stay there, not paid properly. Sex industry can be tricky. Folks may take advantage of legal spaces to traffic people through. For example, strip clubs, pornography, places that are legally existing, people can traffic people within strip clubs or pornography. And then we have health and beauty, massage parlors, and social services, which is an unfortunate reality. Traffickers are very, very smart people. They know where vulnerable people go to get services, so there are a lot of situations where they take advantage of that. They may volunteer in those places, work in those places. There have been a lot of situations where traffickers may become foster parents in order to exploit youth that way, or use youth to recruit other youth in the foster care system, things like that. Hospitality can be kind of twofold. If we're thinking about hotels specifically, people may be labor trafficked that are working there, and then there may be sex trafficking taking place in the rooms. In construction, forestry, and agriculture, I kind of group together in that there's just a lot less oversight for those jobs. We see them all the time, we drive by them all the time, just not really people stopping and checking in on those people, making sure they know they're right, and they're relying on a lot of seasonal migrant work a lot of the time. So folks may be told you're going to come work this great job, make money and go home, and then that may not be the case. Again, they may let their documentation expire or take advantage of them in ways like that. Door-to-door sales, not necessarily common, but can be seen where they may be dropped off and told to reach a certain quota. Kids still sell magazines, chocolate bars, door-to-door. So the only reason that would raise red flags is if maybe they had very scripted communication about what it was for. Maybe they were kind of looking around. The trafficker is typically not far away in those situations. And maybe we're just really hesitant to answer a lot of questions if you ask more questions about that. Next, I want to kind of transition to what does it look like here in Indiana? What are the numbers, the data, statistics, things like that? Does it really happen here, right? Of course, we're talking about it, so of course it does. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about this map. So what we're looking at is a heat map. The more red it is, the more calls were placed to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. This is 2019, the most recent data we have. What are our thoughts? What are things you notice about the map?
It's very frequent in our area.
Yeah, really frequent in our area. We're pretty red, right? Any thoughts on why Indiana's pretty red? Why are there a lot of calls being placed here?
I work for interstate a lot.
Yeah, are the crossroads of America, right? And so we have access to a lot of really big cities really easily. But today we all learned in the beginning, transportation doesn't have to happen for something to be trafficking. It can though. And so that is one of the factors, right? So folks may realize we have really big, easy access to travel from place to place, whether that's to stay hidden, to traffic folks in different areas, whatever that may be. Yeah, that's one contributing factor. Other thoughts about why Indiana is pretty red, or other things you notice about that?
The hot spots seem to be like the capitals, so it's like where like international airports are.
Yeah, so there's hot spots around capitals where there's more populated areas, maybe where airports are.
By the coast.
Mm-hmm. You see a lot around the coast.
Indiana is known for agriculture, so if you're talking about migrant workers especially, you would have a lot of labor trafficking in Indiana.
Exactly. Indiana is known for agriculture. We have a lot of agricultural jobs. A lot of folks relying on that seasonal migrant work where, again, folks see that as an easy way to exploit someone else. Again, they may lie to them from the beginning about the documentation process. We've got you all set up. You're good to go. Or they withhold it, just take it away from them. We're going to keep this safe for you. Don't have to worry about it, things like that. So that leads to a lot of labor trafficking, right? And where they traffic people that way. And again, that can include not being paid properly, not having good working conditions, living conditions, things like that. Other thoughts about why Indiana's pretty red? There's one more pretty big contributing factor.
Is it close to the gambling casinos or sports venues?
Yeah, so sometimes it can be more red or closer to big events or casinos or things like that. That can be a part of what people want to experience when they go to something, right? We see a lot of it in Indiana specifically, day to day, right? We have a lot of rural areas as well, and so we see a lot more folks just being trafficked day to day, but there can be increases around spaces like that. Another big thing we're facing in Indiana is a lot of folks living with addiction, a lot of substance misuse going on. And we know that substance abuse and human trafficking are very intertwined. So we talked about traffickers having power and control over someone else, right? Creating that climate of fear. Well, if someone's living with an addiction, they have an immediate way they can hold power over that person. Until you do this for me, you do not get access to this substance, whatever it may be, right? And so those are super, super intertwined, and we know that's a big issue in Indiana too. So I want to put a positive twist on this though, because this is actually Indiana being pretty red, a good thing, because that means in Indiana, one, people knew what they were identifying. They knew what human trafficking was, and two, they knew what to do about it. They knew to call the hotline. So that's a resource you're all going to be equipped with after today as well, if you don't have it already. So in that sense, where there are less dots does not mean there is less trafficking. It means there is less people calling. Because we're more red does not mean we necessarily have more trafficking. It means we're calling, right? So that could mean that there's a lack of education and resources in some of these areas where there's less dots from the hotline. And with that said, I'd love to show you some Indiana specific numbers. Now, if you're a data person, data is nearly impossible to gather for a very, very underrated crime. Polaris estimates that this only captures 1 to 2% of cases that happen, meaning this is 1 to 2% of the problem, right? So we know we're quite literally on the tip of the iceberg right here. But as you can see, the hotline calls in Indiana and the cases reported in Indiana have gone up every year. Now, again, this is not to be a panic moment or a scary moment. This is actually what we want. We want to increase identification first. We cannot serve folks for something that we aren't even identifying, right? And we really have a lot more of the hidden in plain sight idea than folks disappearing. So unfortunately, a lot of times these folks are living in our community. So if we can identify them, we can help them serve them, right? And so ITVAP, my organization, is not a direct service provider. So victims and survivors can't come into our doors and get help. We are the network that connects the service providers. And so through that network from October 2015 to July 2019, we were able to serve over 730 trafficked youth. Again, understanding that that's quite literally scratching the surface on what's actually happening. So if you're a numbers person, I hope this is helpful, but again, keeping in mind that we know it's pretty underreported. But if you're a numbers person, check out Polaris's website. They have a lot of really user-friendly data that they share on there as well. Any questions questions up to this point about anything, or comments, or thoughts? No? Cool. So now what we're going to do is hear a little bit from Aubrey. Aubrey is a survivor leader and advocate that we work alongside, who agreed to record her story and what happened in her specific trafficking situation. It's broken up into pieces throughout the rest of our time. If time allows, we'll kind of walk through most of what she has to share. And we want to look at this as sort of a case study. If this is a student that you're working with, a family that you're working with, what are things that you notice about what she shares? Does anything surprise you? Does it not surprise you? So we're just going to hear a little bit from her, and then I'll ask kind of things that stick out to you about her story. She's a survivor of domestic minor sex trafficking, meaning she's from the States, happened in the States, and she was a minor, and it was sex trafficking. So I tested the sound. We should be good. Keep me posted if you can't hear, because I have control of the noise. And here we go.
Sports, I was very active with my friends. So on the outside looking in, even if I had some things going on at home and I had some past abuses, I looked like a pretty well-adjusted teenage kid that was doing pretty well in school. And then this one night, this group of kids came in, just like any other night, since it was a convenience store. And this one particular girl stopped and said, "I love the way you do your hair." And as a 16-year-old girl, I was like, "Oh wow, thanks." And she appeared older, and so that's always kind of fun. And so she ended up coming in a couple of nights after that, and we just, again, we're talking, and eventually, she's like, "You should meet the mall, we should, just hang out one day." And so I did.
Okay, our video and audio were not lined up very well. Sorry if that was distracting, but would love to hear what people think, right? We just heard a little bit about Aubrey and kind of what's happening here. What do you notice about what she shared?
Seems so innocent.
Seems so innocent, right? So this was not some creepy dude in an alley like, "Hey, you want to come work for me and do this thing with me?" It was a girl close to her age, slightly older, that she could see herself being friends with, that straight up just asked her to hang out. And not only that, she asked her to hang out in a public space. Teenagers going to the mall, very normal, right? It's an innocent, normal request. So far, nothing in her 16-year-old brain seems too out of the ordinary, right? What else from this part did you notice? They gave her compliments. Yeah, give her compliments to kind of build her trust, build her self-esteem, also to see kind of how she reacts to that. Like, does she have really good self-esteem? Does she not? But commenting on her physical appearance.
At the beginning, she said she plays sports, so it's not like the loner that needed attention. She was pretty active and social on her own.
Yes, she was involved in extracurriculars. She described herself as an average kid at school. So not always necessarily the loner or the kid that you may think of first. She was just an average typical kid who was involved at school. She briefly mentions past abuses, so we know there may be some stuff that's going on at home, but we don't know a ton about it yet. It's so far a pretty normal teenage interaction, right? She's at her after-school job. She doesn't exclusively say that, but that convenience store is her after-school job. Another typical thing for a teenager to be doing, right? So far, nothing is too out of the ordinary. Here on this slide, what I want to point out is these top three items: wanting to feel special, wanting to belong, wanting to feel safe, universally felt among our students, among humans in general. We all want those things. We want to feel special, belong, and feel safe. But once these bottom three come into play, once someone needs resources, maybe they have nowhere to go, maybe they don't have a strong support system or a trusted adult they can go to for help, those are the things that traffickers are identifying. Does this person need access to something they don't have? What are the things that make them vulnerable, right? And so oftentimes youth are just a few steps away, right, from being targeted or groomed to be trafficked. Okay, we're gonna hear a little bit more from Aubrey. I'm gonna see if I do it differently if we can line up the video and audio.
Shopping, and she was just like, met her down at the mall, and, she ended up taking me shopping. And she was just like, oh, that's a really cute shirt. You look really good in that color. And I was like, oh, that's kind of expensive. I was a Goodwill kid. I wanted to get the most bang for my buck. To go to a mall to buy something was just kind of outside of my realm of reality. And I was like, no, I got it. Don't even worry about it, girl. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then later we ended up going and getting, pedicures. And I had never had a pedicure done before. And I was like, this is really cool. And she's so much fun. And that was just kind of the start of our friendship. And, looking back, I was absolutely being isolated from any other support system. They became my entire world. And again, I think sometimes we have this misperception because of different things in the media that this happens really quickly. This was almost a 6-month investment into my life. And so, no one questioned it for 6 months.
Okay, what about this part that Aubrey shares sticks out to you? Anything surprise you?
Happened over a period of time.
Happened over a period of time.
I was just gonna say it's a really long time investment, you would think at that point that you're actually friends.
6 months of just being friends. Why wouldn't you believe you were just friends, right? And we know too, with youth, like friendships change all the time. 6 months they were just hanging out and being friends. Nothing too out of the ordinary, right? And so again, we often hear kidnapping and trafficking in the same sentence, in the same situation. They're actually very separate things. Kidnapping and trafficking are almost never the same thing. There's a reason for that, right? If someone kidnapped you, walked out today and someone kidnapped you, what would you do? You would freak. You would freak out. You would try and get away. You'd be like, I want nothing to do with you. Goodbye. This is not a good situation, right? But if someone who's your best friend of 6 months, right, you're a 16-year-old, tells you, hey, I got this opportunity for you. I'd love for you to try this job. I'd love for you to do this thing with me. You would believe them. They have your best intentions in mind, right? You'd probably trust them. You may love them. Much more likely to go along with something that they say, right? It's literally an investment for them. They will financially benefit from it in the long run. They will benefit from investing the time in building the relationship first, right? You are much less likely to run away, tell on them, any of the above, right? If you already have an existing relationship. So most of the time, there is some sort of grooming or relationship built first, which is a really important distinction, right? Not that no one's never kidnapped into a trafficking situation, but most of the time there's some sort of relationship. Other things that stuck out to people or that you noticed that she said. Yeah.
It seemed like, when you go fishing, you bait your hook, and it seems like this girl really went for the bait, and, now she feels obligated.
Yes.
It's kind of mind game there.
You said feels obligated and mind game. So exactly. They want to layer things on that makes that person feel like it was their choice or their fault that they get into the situation. Again, it's an investment. They know they will benefit in the long run if this person feels like they are there by choice or by their own fault or, just the way that it played out. So they kind of hooked her in with something and now she feels maybe that she owes them, right? They're buying her things and they're not saying, it's your turn to pay for the pedicures, right? They're just constantly buying her things and giving her things. Again, here's where we can see those external red flags. We, as an adult, would be like, red flag, right? But in her teenage brain, a Goodwill kid, right? She's like, they're taking care of me. They're giving me things that maybe my mom wants to give me and can't. Things like that, right? And so we see that grooming kind of start to play out.
They tend to try to make it their idea.
They what?
They tend to try to make it the victim's idea.
Exactly.
That way the victim will defend the idea that they thought they came up with in the end. So they argue with the victim down the road. They're going to defend the choice.
Exactly. That's a really important part of this, is that victims of trafficking, right, do not want to be rescued. They often don't say, oh my gosh, thank you for saving me from this situation, right? They're going to fear or love their trafficker way more than they're going to fear law enforcement, right, or respect or trust law enforcement. They're going to stand up for their trafficker, again, potentially have very strong feelings toward them. They may feel, again, that it's their own fault or their own choice to do this, may not even understand that they were coerced or forced into it. So it's very, very complicated because when we identify this in someone, that doesn't mean all of a sudden they want help. They may not. And that's what can get really tricky. Now, of course, with youth, right, as mandatory reporters, you can report regardless, but it can get really tricky with adults too. But yeah, really great point. They want them to think it was their decision.
Sounds like she didn't have a lot of supervision or people checking in. It went 6 months unnoticed and isolated from other friends, or maybe she didn't have a lot of friends.
Mm-hmm.
My mom was the house, you're like, oh, I don't know them, you're not going to their house. So there's
Exactly.
no way that I probably would have gotten into that myself, but it doesn't sound like there was people checking on her or really caring what she's doing.
Exactly. So they are identifying that. Does she have a support system that's going to check in about why she's getting all these pedicures, why she's only hanging out with us and no one else, care where she is at all, right? And so they wouldn't have followed up with you, right? Because they would have been like, okay, well, mom's going to be asking questions. The traffickers are vetting them as well. They wanted to see how she responded, if she had a strong support system, right? Seeing if she was necessarily a good victim for the situation. And in which case we see her support system is not strong and pretty much non-existent. And so this isolation process is part of that, right? We want to be your people, your whole world, put all your trust and all your love in us, right? And so we see that kind of playing out too. Really great points on this part, as well as we see just kind of how the grooming process plays out with Aubrey's story. So who's vulnerable? Who is vulnerable to being trafficked? Again, we're talking mostly about youth because that's the primary group that ITVAP can serve. And of course, who most of us work with, but understanding that it happens to adults as well. So you could check none of these boxes and be trafficked, or check all of them and never be trafficked, but some of the most common youth populations that we work with are runaway and homeless youth. There are a lot of studies done around kids who are on the run, and their likelihood of being targeted or groomed just shoots through the roof when they are on the run. This is also why DCS is to do a human trafficking screening every time a runaway is recovered. Youth in poverty, any sort of system involvement, abuse, neglect, substance abuse, or untreated mental health issues. Those two could also apply to anyone in the home, not necessarily the youth themselves experiencing that, but being around those things as well. LGBTQIA+ youth, immigrant and migrant youth, and refugee and asylum-seeking youth. Again, just some of the most common populations that we come across in these situations. It's also important to point out that youth of color are also targeted more and more vulnerable. So on the left, we have trafficking survivors we've been able to serve, and on the right, so this is our own data, ITVAP's data, and on the right is the general population of Indiana. So if 10% of Indiana identifies as African American, they make up 30% of the victims we have had the opportunity to serve through our grants. If 7% identify as Hispanic or Latino, that makes up 26% of the youth we've had the opportunity to serve. So again, we know youth of color are disproportionately targeted for trafficking as well. Okay, we're going to hear a little bit more from Aubrey. Any questions up to this point? Or thoughts? Let's try it again.
And then I was doing French homework. And my mom came home and she was making fun of the way I was pronouncing some of my words, and I got entirely frustrated. And I called my friend and I was crying. And I was like, I just can't deal with this. Like, I'm trying to do my homework and my mom is making fun of me and she's drunk and I don't know what to do. And she's like, just pack up some stuff and just come over here. Just come stay with us. I'll make sure you get to school. You know, you can have your sister come over and hang out. Like, just don't worry about it no more. And in my 16-year-old brain, I was like, thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to get out of the mess that I thought I was living in. And so I said yes. And I packed up my stuff and I snuck out and I ran away for the first time. And so I got to her house. We sat down and had dinner like we had done a dozen times before. And then I was asked a question that changed my entire life. I was asked, would I want to join their escort service? And all of a sudden, I'm like, I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand what's going on. They're talking about that they actually run an escort service, and the stepfather was actually the ringleader of this escort service, and the mom and the daughter both worked for them, and you know, they wanted to give me a really great opportunity to join and make some money. And so as I'm trying to kind of figure out what this all means, they can obviously see panic on my face. And my friend is trying to tell me how great this is, and how it has nothing to do with sex. Sex isn't even involved in this. You just could go on dates and make lots of money. And then, her stepfather around him in, you want to save up money for college, right? Well, yeah, of course they do. This is a great way to do that. You can make money really quickly. And it was such a normalized conversation, literally as we're eating dinner at the kitchen table. And I remember at one point looking out their kitchen window and thinking, I'm in a completely different world and I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I very simply said, I really don't want to be part of this. And they kind of looked at each other and they're like, that's fine. We're here for you. We're, whatever you need, let us know. If you change your mind, let me know. And then I continued eating my spaghetti and going on with dinner, thinking that was going to be the end of that conversation.
Okay, so kind of a lot happened in this part, but let's unpack things that we noticed from this part. What stuck out to you about how this played out?
The family business.
It's a family business. Weird, disturbing, right? It's the stepfather's the ringleader of the whole situation, right? Mom and daughter are all involved. It's like a family situation. Another thing too to think about when we're looking at this dynamic now, in the beginning, the girl walks in, she starts talking to her, we're like, okay, this is the bad guy. This is the person involved in trafficking. We know this is a story about trafficking. But now, looking at the situation, what do we think about the daughter, the girl that befriended Aubrey? Is she also a victim of trafficking? Is she maybe being forced to go recruit other people? Right? So these situations are very difficult from the outside looking in. Someone who is recruiting someone else appears to be voluntarily involved in that situation, but it is so common that victims of trafficking are forced to recruit other victims. They are told serious threats are caused physical harm or all types of abuse if they don't do so. And so imagine the layers that adds on, right? Well, who am I to come forward and say this horrific thing is happening to me when I'm now somewhat involved in the perpetrating part of this, right? Again, traffickers are smart people, right? They know adding those layers on makes it really difficult for people to leave. So, right, most likely, the daughter's also a victim of trafficking as well, being forced to recruit more people. Other thoughts about how this happened and what kind of happened here?
She was like trapped,
Yeah.
basically, because she had just gotten in a fight with her mom and didn't really have anyone to call or text or SOS and they took advantage of that because they knew that's why she came over there.
Exactly. They took advantage of that vulnerable moment, that vulnerable night, right, where they were like, we know we're her people. She's going to call us when she has these vulnerable moments. We can convince her, right, to come and stay with us, come be a part of our family. It was over spaghetti dinner, right, which is probably something she's been longing for, that family environment, those family dinners. And they took advantage of that seemingly safe space, right, to spring this on her. Anything else surprise you or things you noticed about this part?
Seems like they didn't push the issue once she told them no. They kind of left it at, well, that's okay, because they can reapproach it later.
Exactly.
Open-ended.
Yes. They were not like, too bad, right? They wanted to keep that trust and rapport going that they had built with her. They're like, totally fine, still here for you, still totally support you, love you. Just let us know, what you need. Still taking that very supportive family approach, which is really interesting. But I want us too to think about youth that we work with, vulnerable youth we've worked with, that how many kids would sit in that seat and say yes? At this point, it's not that crazy, right? These people love me, they are supporting me, they are right. I don't really have any other way to pay for college. My mom can't help me with that. I believe they have my best interest in mind. So if they're saying it's safe, I believe them, right? So again, this is just one situation of how it can play out. But this could have played out very differently. But even then, they wanted to still let her know they supported her, which is really interesting. Anything else from this part?
You're trying to normalize it, makes it sound very unthreatening. It's not sex, it's just dating.
Exactly.
Non-threatening and just normal. Like, oh,
Yes.
like back to the family business thing. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
And it really is. But she's stuck, like Megan said. So like, what?
She's stuck. She's put all her eggs in one basket. She literally ran away and went to this house. Now what do I do, right? And they know that. They know she's going to feel that sense of like, well, I have to stay here, right? But making it so totally normal and seem very low risk and very high reward, right? Only great things will come from this. You'll make a bunch of money and it'll be off. Awesome. Really great points and thoughts and perspectives on that part too. We talked a lot about grooming, but some examples of grooming, and we saw some of these present in Aubrey's stories as well, could be gift giving or favors to a particular person. Again, we saw them buying her things, giving her things. There's often a power imbalance involved of maybe age or status, so someone who has some sort of title or leadership over another person or is a little bit older. Oftentimes that includes things being secretive. This often works again with younger kids, right? This is a secret. Breaking the rules for special occasions. So, well, this is just what we do around the holidays or in the summers or whatever that may be. Creating occasions to be alone with you. And then lastly, the promise of a better life. So outside of folks who are born into a trafficking situation where it's quite literally their only normal, the promise of a better life is almost always there. There is something great that's going to happen if you're involved in this. Something awesome is going to come from this, right? You're going to finally get to go to college, pay for that car, get that house, feed your kids, whatever that may be. There's almost always some sort of promise of a great thing that will come from it. Who knows about Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yeah, but it's cool. I love that. So we all know what this is, right? We work from the bottom up. Gotta have our physiological needs met before safety, and on up. So when they met Aubrey that day in the store, they came in. Where do we think she would have fell on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? The day they walked in, she's sitting behind the counter. Not belonging. Did someone say belonging?
I said from Bob, she's got a lot of psychological needs. She just, she doesn't feel like she belongs, and so if
Yeah.
she's there at the bottom three for sure, but probably the very bottom one.
Yeah, so we can assume she had a house. We know she lived with her mom. We understand she most likely had access to food, right? Going to school, things like that. But she may or may not have felt safe. She talks about mom coming home drunk. So there was potentially substance abuse in the home. But love and belonging was really big to her. She wanted to belong to this group, belong in some way, feel like she belonged to something, right? And so, right, we can guess somewhere in that area. The important part about Maslow's within the trafficking realm is that traffickers use this tool. There have literally been books written by traffickers with this in it. Whether or not they know what it's called, this is what they're doing. It's the trafficker's version of meeting them where they're at. Where is this person at? What needs do they need filled? How can I fill them, right? And be that person's support. And so it's a really important thing for us to understand that they use that to identify it, because then on the other end, as service providers and people trying to help, we may be able to figure out what needs are being met by that trafficker in an unhealthy way. So we can help meet them in a healthy way. So recruiting behaviors in youth. Again, this would externally appear like this youth is pro-trafficking, right? They are promoting trafficking and things like that, but are often a victim of trafficking being forced to do so. That may look like an older youth befriending a younger youth. Could be related to gang involvement, talking about the game or the life. Money, partying, getting hair and nails done, getting taken care of. It's sometimes called selling the dream. Maybe folks with really dominant personalities or folks that show excessive loyalty. Maybe flashing money or access to expensive things. Isolating vulnerable youth or turning youth against each other. Being really secretive or exchanging private information, planning to run. And contact after discharge is relating to folks involved in residential facilities, keeping in contact with those folks after they get out. These are just some examples, again, just because a kid has money, right? Does not mean they're being trafficked, but or recruiting, but some things that, if a lot of these things were present, could mean that recruiting is happening. So it's not news to us that social media can be used, right, for lots of things. But unfortunately, recruitment in trafficking is one of those things. So just understand that anywhere that people are talking to people, we've seen it. Anywhere that people can interact with other people, there has been grooming, recruitment. Gaming systems, Snapchat, Fortnite, Instagram, Facebook, all of it. So a big part of this conversation now, when we do our presentation with youth about what trafficking is, we talk a lot about blackmail and sending nudes. If you send someone a nude and you're youth, they can immediately use that for blackmail. Well, now I want a video. Well, now I want you to meet up with me. Well, now I want this from you, or I'm going to send your photos to everyone, right? And so that can quickly turn into a trafficking situation. And so we share with kids, while they know they're not supposed to send nudes, even if they did and they feel like they have done something wrong, that we really want to keep an open line of communication about social media. We still want them to feel safe enough to come forward to a trusted adult if they started to be groomed or blackmailed or something of that nature. It's really hard for kids when they know they're not supposed to be doing it. They feel like, well, I've already done something wrong, I don't want to tell anyone, but those situations can quickly grow out of control. And so that's a big part of the conversation we have with them. Okay, a little bit more from Aubrey.
And my friend had asked me if I'd want to go out with her to a party. There were other kids there. There was drinking and music. I didn't drink, so my friend grabbed me a Coke. So that night, it was a Friday night, and my friend had asked me if I'd want to go out with her to a party. There were other kids there. There was drinking and music. I didn't drink, so my friend grabbed me a Coke. She handed it to me. Again, thought everything was pretty normal. Started drinking my Coke, and then I completely blacked out. But what I do remember is waking up to being sexually assaulted. When the rape was over and the person left the room, I remember sitting there in the dark thinking, I wish I was just dead. Like, how am I even here? What was going on? Where was I? What was I going to do? Where are my clothes? And then the door opened, and I seen Dante, who was my friend's stepfather. And he threw me my clothes, and he looked me in my face and said, "This is the last time you ever tell me no."
So, as we may have guessed, no was not accepted as an answer, right? And I want us to remember this is one example of what trafficking can look like. Not every person is, right, drugged at a party, now they're being trafficked. But that's what happened with Aubrey, and that can be the way that it happened, right? So in their approach, they took a long time to build a really strong relationship, but then wanted to do a really fast power dynamic switch. I'm in charge, you are not, from this point forward, right? And use that climate of fear piece, the threats piece, the coercion part, in order to keep Aubrey in that situation, right? So now you can imagine her whole world has crushed. She feels completely hopeless and alone after isolating herself from everyone else. So she is very, very stuck at this point. And I want to talk too about just kind of the relationships that are involved in a trafficking situation. We've talked a little bit about this already, but what we're looking at is a study that we use, and it's very accurate to what we see in Indiana. The most common type of relationship between a trafficker and their victims is immediate family, followed by boyfriends or romantic partnerships, friends of family, employers, and lastly, strangers. So, stranger danger is real. We still need to teach kids that, right? And seeing information about like the zip ties on cars in parking lots and things like that we see on Facebook, very real situations. They're just often typically separate from trafficking. Most commonly, if someone is at risk of trafficking, it's someone that they know, someone that's in their family, someone that is in their support system, someone that is dating them or really getting to know them. And there's most often a relationship that revolves around love and support involved. And again, this is a really unfortunate reality, but important for us to understand what it is actually going to look like, right? It's not some random person that person doesn't know. We want to be more aware of the people that are actually in their life. And one reason we can attribute that, like, it is immediate family members, because that's really hard to wrap our minds around, is one, just the cycle of abuse. Folks grow up with their own abuse. Maybe they were trafficked or experienced physical or sexual abuse, grow up, don't have access to proper treatment and resources for those things, and it becomes a cycle. And they may abuse their own children as well. Also thinking about substance abuse. Folks may realize, I don't have to come up with the money to support this addiction when I may be able to exchange someone in my family directly for that, right? And so people make those really unfortunate decisions in some of those situations. So again, really important for us to understand what it can look like. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to skip this video because we have another one that I want to show. And I want to make sure we have time. So a lot of folks ask this question: why didn't you just leave? So she's going to school still, right? A lot of times folks are still going to the doctor, they're still doing things, normal life things. Why didn't she just go somewhere else after school, right? And so I think she does an excellent job of kind of answering why people get really stuck in these situations. I would say.
So at this point, at kind of my story, a lot of people ask me, why didn't you just leave? There was something inside of you that obviously was triggering that this was a bad situation, and why didn't you just go? And that's a great question that I want to kind of try to give an answer to. One, I was 16, so I didn't even have the ability to make really good rational decisions. I felt like this was my choice because I had made a choice to have a friend that led me to this decision. I had chose to run away. I had chose to not leave immediately that night. And I think because of my past abuse, I just felt like this was my life. These were the cards that I was dealt, and I didn't have any other options, and I had to just suck it up and live with it. Plus, all the people that were around this issue and these experiences, I didn't know who I could trust. Could I really trust police because there are police around this issue? Could I really trust an adult because there were obviously adults that were buying us? I didn't know if there was anyone that I could turn to that wasn't involved in this, so I didn't feel like I could trust anybody. And there was lots of violence that we witnessed and experienced. And it was very inconsistent violence. You know, sometimes I would do something wrong and then one of the other girls would get beat for it. Maybe they would do something right and I was like, oh, good for you. And then I would get beat for it. And so there was this level of violence that we never quite understood what was going on. There was always lots of threats. There was weapons around. These guys were obviously pretty dangerous. I remember one girl had said something to Dante and they took her out on the street and they just were jumping on her and kicking her and then she disappeared. I don't know what happened to her. Maybe they took her to the emergency room. Maybe she ended up dead. I don't know. But that was enough for my 16-year-old brain to realize I had no other option than to just go ahead and keep doing what I was doing.
So, I want to look at Aubrey's story as we wrap up her part of the story, what we identify in her life. So thinking all the way back to the beginning, we had the AMP model, and we said we needed force, fraud, and coercion force, fraud, or coercion for something to be considered trafficking. So, hint, Aubrey experienced all three. You guys didn't know you were going to be pop quizzed, but I'm pop quizzing you. Can anyone identify force, fraud, or coercion? An example of those in her story. So if this was the student you knew and you knew all this about your student, could you identify force, fraud, or coercion in her life? Yeah.
I would presume a fraudulent relationship as far as that supposed stepfather, supposed and elder daughter. That was part of the representation, wholesome family support system.
So they lied to her about maybe who they were, and that's a good point too. So this can be families, actual blood families. It can also be people posing as families, right? And so they may not have been an actual family, and they lied about what the job was. They said there's no sex involved, and that was not true. Fraud. Thank you. Force or coercion? Any examples that you can think of? Yeah.
Again, the force being the roofie or whatever, whatever has happened to her, she found herself in the situation. So she was essentially forced to do an act, and forced to coercion afterwards. But physical violence that basically refers to this is I'm going to ask, and she the lobster report.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. That's exactly right. Force. Again, that thing's happening to their physical body. They drugged her. She was assaulted and physically harmed. And coercion, threats. Threats are a form of coercion. So this is trafficking, right? 100%. But if you also remember, if this were a case that was moving forward in court, we wouldn't have to prove those items because she was a minor and it was for sex trafficking, right? But that's our tool to identify that trafficking is happening. So that's the part that you all will utilize. Is there force, fraud, or coercion happening here? So, human trafficking in our schools. Traffickers can use schools as a place to recruit. Again, it's often, though, going to be students, other youth doing so. But traffickers may be in contact with students through texting or social media while they're physically in the building. So, some red flags. This can include chronic truant runaway or homeless youth. Branding can be used, not as often as it used to, but maybe they all have the same tattoo or the name of the trafficker somewhere tattooed on them. Maybe they have excess cash, goods, or services they can't afford, so all of a sudden they come to school with new stuff. Would only really raise flags if they didn't want to tell you where they got it from. Maybe someone else has control of their ID, having hotel keys or multiple cell phones. Maybe lack of knowledge of their whereabouts, maybe they've been moved around. Having really scripted or restricted communication. Again, kind of answering the same thing no matter what you ask. It may be clear that someone has told them how to answer questions. The presence of a controlling adult or partner, and of course signs of physical, sexual, or psychological trauma. Red flags specific to the school setting. Changes in behaviors or school participation. So while Aubrey went to school, that is true, she was still going to school, she dropped her extracurriculars, her grades were dropping, she was falling asleep in class, right? Those three things can mean a whole plethora of things, right? But But having human trafficking on the radar is what we want to do, right? Is have it something that could be considered. Exhibit sexual behavior that's high risk or inappropriate for their age. Just having knowledge of the commercial sex industry. Maybe just acting out in class, being more angry. So of course, educator involvement is essential. Of course, students spend a lot of time in school. And so just being here today, right, is a huge step in helping fight trafficking in our community, just knowing about it. Knowing about it and being able to share knowledge with others in our community is a huge part of that. So our last few things, I know we have like 2 minutes, are reporting, but this is really, really important. You're all familiar with the DTS hotline. You're all familiar that we're all mandated reporters in Indiana. But there's one thing I want to share with you, and that's that we want to tell them we suspect human trafficking. Even if you feel like, I forget everything that lady said when she came to talk to us. If you suspect it's human trafficking, please say that, because that's really helpful for the hotline as they take notes, what screening questions they ask, and can help get that information together for that case. If there's an adult involved, we're calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can even call the hotline as well if we're dealing with big youth. They are an amazing resource. Even though it's a national line, they do call us, we call them, and they get folks access to resources that they need. So if you do identify a situation of potential trafficking, you've properly reported it, and you want resources for that person, that's what I'm here for. Basically the local version of this. So you can either reach out to me or the national hotline in order to get access to resources for that person, for that situation. Even if you're not 1,000% sure it's trafficking, even if you just think it might be. So we have reached the end of our time. What I would love to do is leave a little bit of space for any questions, thoughts, ideas, things we didn't talk about that you wish we had. While you're doing that, I have an evaluation. Now, this is a fancy QR code, which is really exciting. But if you can't get this to work, we're going to send this out afterwards. But I would really value your opinion on how today went, how the conversation went, and would love to hear your feedback on this day to help us make it the best it can be. So if you're comfortable and want to, you can take out your phone, zoom in on this little box, and it should pop it up right now on your phone. You can do it right now. If not, we'll be emailing it later. Feel free to do that too. But I'd love to hear. Does anyone have questions, thoughts, or anything from today? Yeah.
There's a situation where the child is 18 and senior.
Okay, so I had a really good question over here. What if they're 18? If they're 18, we are now going to be calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline. But if they're 18 and they don't want to make a report, they don't have to. So if they're a youth, we are mandated to report. If we suspect trafficking, even if we're not sure, we have to call the DTS office, regardless. If they're an adult, they don't want to make a report, but they've reached out to you, you've identified trafficking, or they have, and you're like, this is what's happening. That's where the National Human Trafficking Hotline comes into play, or me. So if they want access to resources, they're like, even if they just need like food or classes or job assistance, whatever that may be, that's something that we can be here for. If they aren't ready to report, or they aren't ready to do anything or take any action against that person, that's where your support is huge and comes into play. As you can see, having a support system is one of the biggest barriers that we can put in place between them and an unhealthy and unhealthy situation. So just being a supportive person in their life makes much more of an impact than you will ever have, right? But that's where it'd be the national hotline that you call, unless they hide because of their own, then it would be yes, but and then or me. And so when you pull this up, which I think everybody did that wanted to, it will ask you for that code, 1103ED, today's date and my initials. But since I can talk about me and contacting me, I'm going to go to the slide with my info. But again, you will have this via email after today. I have a couple handouts, the evaluation that I'll send out, and my information, so that if you ever need assistance or come across any situations, feel free to reach out to me. Or if you're involved in other groups and you're like, I would love this other group in my life to talk about human trafficking, we do training presentations all the time. We'll be happy to do so. Really good questions. Other questions or thoughts? Again, anything we did or didn't talk about that you want to follow up on, anything at all? I want to say a huge thank you. Again, our world in general is heavy right now. I know we're all dealing with so much between COVID and life and things. So I don't want this to feel like one more thing to worry about. I want us to feel empowered, right, with knowledge and tools after today that we can help serve our students and the people in our life. So I hope it feels that way, but I greatly appreciate your participation and attention this afternoon on this topic. But I am here, I'll hang for a couple minutes if there's other thoughts or follow-up that anybody has. Thank you in advance for filling out the evaluation, and y'all are great. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, I realize.